As late as 1951, President Truman hoped that Dwight David Eisenhower would accept the 1952 Democratic presidential nomination. However, Ike leaned towards moderate Republicanism, and he feared that Mr. Conservative, Senator Robert Taft, would win the 1952 Republican nomination. A group of Eastern moderate Republicans convinced Ike to run as a way of stopping Taft. Eisenhower lacked the megalomania of MacArthur or the drama and arrogance of Patton. He was a military man with a reassuring persona that vets and civilians could identify with as a safe, sober candidate with military experience, but with no political experience. In many ways, Ike appeared the ultimate outside Washington candidate. Ike's campaign manager successfully used the New Hampshire and Minnesota primaries to impress Republican Party leaders of Ike's popularity with the voters. Party leaders and Republican urban political bosses decided that Eisenhower presented a better image for the Republican Party in 1952. Television images of Eisenhower and Taft at the Republican convention helped Ike and hurt Taft. Ironically, Ike's campaign managers proved more adept than Taft's at the convention in winning a dispute over delegates, allowing Ike to win the nomination. Initially, after winning the Republican nomination, Eisenhower's lack of political experience proved a handicap. He was a popular candidate, but a poor campaigner. Ike was a bad stump speaker, and he did not like traditional backslapping American politics. As the 1952 campaign progressed, Ike improved his style and warmed to campaigning, reaching out to voters. One major problem that developed during the campaign that could have created a major stumbling block for Ike got resolved by the clever use of television by his running mate, Richard Nixon, the Republican vice presidential candidate. The press uncovered evidence of Nixon having a secret campaign slush fund that raised questions about Nixon's honesty. Reporters asked questions about the sources of the campaign funds and the use of the money. However, Nixon went on national television with his wife, 2 daughters, and dog to explain that he was a veteran of modest means with the ideal American family, a used car, and a pet dog named Checkers, another campaign gift. The so-called Checkers speech was one of the most successful uses of the new medium by a political candidate. It saved his place on the ticket, and even Ike's wife Mamie cried on hearing Nixon. Democrats selected Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson, an outspoken liberal candidate. Stevenson delivered good campaign speeches, and political commentators gave him high marks for the content and style of his speeches. Unfortunately for Democrats, Stevenson's speeches appeared above the heads of the electorate. He lacked the directness and common touch of Truman, and appeared too aloof to the average voter compared to the reassuring image of Ike. Republicans used the issues of communism, loss of China, corruption, and Korea against Stevenson and the Democrats. Many veterans, even those that traditionally voted for the Democrats, jumped ship and voted for their former commander, General Eisenhower. Other voters felt that since the Democrats controlled the White House for 20 years, the time had come for a change to a safe Republican. Eisenhower won 55% of the vote to 45% of Stevenson, and carried 442 electoral votes compared to 89 for Stevenson. Ironically, the liberal and pro-civil rights Stevenson only won majorities in most of the southern and border states. In 1952, the Solid South remained fairly solid for the Democrats, while the rest of the country went for Ike, including Stevenson's own Illinois and Truman's Missouri. "We like Ike" became the political truism of 1952, as the Republicans gained a narrow majority in Congress. Voters found Eisenhower more appealing than the Republican Party as a whole in 1952, as subsequent elections in 1954, 56, and 58 suggested. Ike was the antithesis of Harry Truman. The new president opposed expanding the role of government and resisted social and economic policies that required federal government action. He condemned the Democratic approach of FDR and Truman as creeping socialism. He promised to reduce public spending, cut federal workers, balance the budget, and cut taxes. The press joked that this cabinet consisted of 8 millionaires and a plumber, Secretary of Labor Martin Durkin. Actually, he did appoint one woman to the cabinet, Ovida Hubby, for the new office of Health, Education, and Welfare. Ike's appointees suggested a pro-business, moderately conservative administration that would not pursue antitrust investigations and favored opening up public lands for private use. Ike was not a conservationist and did not follow in the footsteps of Theodore Roosevelt. Republicans in Congress transferred control of offshore oil rights from the federal to state governments, a move that pleased oil companies and angered conservationists. His administration rejected calls for a public power project on the Snake River, similar to the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. However, his policies were moderate enough not to send liberals and moderates into the streets to protest administration policies. Ike did nothing to repeal any of the New Deal measures. When the Democrats regained control of Congress in the off-year elections of 1954, the president endorsed an extension of Social Security in 1955 to 10 million more Americans, and an additional extension in 1957. He supported federal funds to expand Federal Highway Act of 1956, and school construction. As president, he used monetary policy and credit policy when the country slipped into recession. Ike later argued in his memoir, Mandate for Change, his willingness to use public works if the economic downturn got worse. In practice, his administration pursued a moderate pragmatic conservatism in dealing with economic and social issues. Eisenhower was a skilled behind-the-scenes manager of the federal government, who decided on broad policies but left the details to subordinates. He gave Sherman Adams, his personal assistant, control over the appointments calendar, deciding who could see the president. On social policies, the president tended to follow a cautious path. Not happy with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, he made no effort to endorse it or publicly speak about the issue of race and segregation, except to say that the Brown decision was now the law of the land. The White House failed to take leadership as the southern states resisted the implementation of the Brown decision. Ike refused to intervene when the Texas governor blocked integration of a high school in that state, and did nothing to help Autherine Lucy when the University of Alabama expelled her. He did not reach out to Martin Luther King during the Montgomery bus boycott, and did nothing to show presidential support for the budding civil rights movement of African Americans in the South. Circumstances forced the president to take a stronger stand than he intended when the governor of Arkansas, Orville Phobos, resisted a court order requiring the integration of Central High School in Little Rock. In 1957, in reaction to the resistance of the governor of Arkansas and the threat of mob violence against the Little Rock Nine, the black teenagers trying to integrate the school, President Eisenhower forcefully acted. Embarrassed by the broken promises of Governor Phobos to comply with the federal court order and national television publicizing Southern resistance, President Eisenhower decided he had to act as commander-in-chief. He ordered the nationalizing of the Arkansas National Guard and sent 1,000 federal paratroopers to protect the students. Ike went on television and denounced the behavior of segregationists in Little Rock. His use of federal troops represented the first time since Reconstruction that the federal government used military force to protect the civil rights of African Americans. Working with Democratic Senate leader Lyndon Johnson, and at the suggestion of Attorney General Herbert Brownell, President Eisenhower endorsed a 1956 proposal for a new civil rights law. Brownell hoped to win back Northern blacks to the Republican Party. Brownell encouraged President Eisenhower to support the first civil rights legislation since the 1870s. Watered down by Southern congressmen, The 1957 Civil Rights Act created a Civil Rights Division within the Justice Department and authorized the Attorney General to investigate violations of voting rights and stop local officials from interfering in the voting rights of American citizens. Meanwhile, during the 1956 presidential election, Republicans renominated the popular Eisenhower, and the Democrats renominated Stevenson. The only mystery in the 1956 election developed at the Democratic Convention over the vice presidential nominee, when Stevenson let the convention select the candidate. Before the convention, Senator Estes Kefauver had gained a national reputation because of his 1951 congressional hearings into organized crime, won the primaries in New Hampshire and Minnesota, seeking to win the 1956 presidential nomination. However, he lost to Stevenson in California, Oregon, and Florida. Governor Averell Harriman of New York also challenged Stevenson for the nomination, but the New York and Chicago political machines backed Stevenson, who easily won the nomination. Stevenson then released the delegates to choose his running mate. 3 candidates appeared: Estes Kefauver, Hubert Humphrey, and John F. Kennedy. Ultimately, Kefauver won the nomination, but Kennedy impressed Democratic leaders with the broad support he obtained, suggesting that an Irish Catholic might win the presidency. The 1956 presidential election was a replay for 1952, with President Eisenhower winning an increased majority, 58% to Stevenson's 42%. Again, Stevenson won the electoral votes of most of the southern states. The rest of the country voted for Ike. While it was a landslide for Eisenhower, the Republicans who lost control of Congress in the off-year election of 1954 failed to regain control in 1956. Once again, Ike proved more popular with the voters than the Republican Party as a whole. In the off-year elections of 1958, the Democrats retained control of Congress. The Democrats controlled 282 to 154 seats in the House and 64 to 34 in the Senate. Ike left office at the end of the second term as one of the most popular presidents in American history. Senator John Kennedy's strong showing in the 1956 Democratic Convention set the stage for his 1960 run for the presidency, and showed party leaders that an Irish Catholic could attract Protestant voters even in the South.